Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. Hey guys, it's Shahram with another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to the interdisciplinary and revolutionary world of Marxism, its politics, its economics, its philosophy, and as we have discovered with Professor Wolff, the psychoanalytic element as well. All right, guys. So, in the last episode, for those of you who haven't checked it out already, Marxism as a critique of Tina, this idea, this defeatist idea that has befuddled revolutionary thinkers all around the world, this idea that there is no alternative, that we must accept a lesser of the two evils world, and just follow the logic of the binary political system. We're gonna ask Professor Wolff, given his background, his understanding of the French German language as well, because he has access to all kinds of media outlets and data that I certainly do not have. But so that's going to be our main question in today's episode: the crisis of thinking and the crisis of political imaginaries, and in particular, thinking about the recent elections in the European Parliament in France, Germany, in all the other European countries, and thinking about. I know he's not a fortune teller, but his vast experience is going to help us understand the November elections in the United States as well. But before all of that, I want to connect our theme today with something really interesting that you said about Hegel. And I'm your student, so I can ask you this rather idiotic question. I mean, I always found it challenging. I mean, I have the book with me right here just to convince you that I did the reading. The guy uses these abstract terms like, the idea with a capital I, or spirit with an S, and it was a signed reading, so I promise you I did it. But what do you have to say to someone like, I mean, I was very fortunate to study this with you guys, but for most people, I mean, even someone like Bertrand Russell said that Hegel is a very, very difficult, scholar to understand. So, what's the deal here? What should we do? Do you understand my
Sure,
frustration?
sure,
My
sure. Yeah, I've heard it all my life. I couldn't really believe it when I kind of looked around already as an adult and discovered that in many universities in the United States, philosophy departments do not have a single semester course in the work of Hegel. They may have one in the work of Immanuel Kant, who comes earlier, upon whose work Hegel builds, but they don't have Hegel. The places that had courses were mostly the Catholic universities in the United States. For some reason, they were friendly. They would have a course or two and some scholars who knew something. But Hegel is in many ways the root of modern Western philosophy, European, American, and so on, in people who try to copy, in people who try to develop, and in people who are critics. They are influenced by Hegel also, as indeed Bertrand Russell was. I'm not interested in many of the abstract problems that Hegel addressed. He left an enormous body of work. He had an enormous influence on Karl Marx, but on many, many other thinkers. Marx, when he was a young man just starting out as a professor of philosophy, was part of something called in Germany at that time the Young Hegelians. They all were students. He was the dominant intellectual shaper of that generation in the 19th century that has been so influential on everybody from Kierkegaard to Albert Camus to Wittgenstein, all of them, the modern powerhouse of thinkers, Bertrand Russell included, in all kinds of ways as inspiration, as foil, and everything in between. You mentioned in the last session something which I think is a way that Hegel is discovered by average people who don't know, because they were never taught Hegel, that that's what they're doing. You made a reference to a study, you were critical, obviously, of a study that wanted to know which was more beautiful between two things. Can you remind me? What were
It
the
was
two
a
things?
it was a study that looks at whether teens that play video games are better looking than teens that don't.
Okay.
Very good
It's one of
question.
those studies. I'm sure it got funded by some government agency very elaborately. But an American confronted with that story will also, an average person, laugh and probably say, or at least many will, that's a very strange experiment because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Oh, in other words, you're studying whether something is beautiful as if we all know and agree on what constitutes beauty, which we know we don't. So, why would you make an experiment premised on something we know is not the case? That's a moment of recognition that something basic like beauty, or even something like measuring, may be contradictions in themselves that you have to work out. That's the Hegel did that. Hegel worked his whole life on that, trying to figure out some of the great issues of the philosophy he inherited from people like Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine or Immanuel Kant or Fichte or Schelling or other great thinkers. And just like you are discovering how you react to the funny story you read about this bizarre experiment that some people made, you might even call that a Hegelian moment. That ought to be sprinkled into your mind. It'll help you understand things. It'll be a tool. Will it useful for everything? No, no tool is. But you will be surprised by the number of things you can think about in new, different, and productive ways if you can imagine that something both exists and doesn't exist at the same time. That things are not always either or, but are both. And that the trick is to see it and then to unravel how they are intertwined. For example, we in the United States right now are in all of a flutter because a significant number of Americans have figured out and started to live the implications that there's not a clear boundary between what is male and what is female, that we all have in ourselves parts of both, and that we may be born with one combination but prefer to live in another combination and make a move to get into. Whoa! But Hegel always knew that we were the combination. The nice, neat separation, you're A or B, goes with, if I can be blunt, a very primitive way of thinking. You don't have to accept the Hegel idea of the unity of opposites, but it's very provocative, very interesting. And had you had it in your mind, you might have foreseen and understood what's happening today in the worlds of the trans and so on, with much less shock and awe than it has caused in so many people who never were exposed to the kind of thinking that might have made this a much less difficult reality to encompass.
Wow.
Okay, let's turn then to what you want to explore about Europe and France.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of use Hegel, who was big on the dialectic, of course, and this duality that he was constantly interested in, and Marx was also interested in that. I wanted to, because you're an expert Hegelian and Marxist, you've spent all your life developing and thinking about, this way of thinking about the world, i.e., the dialectic. And you have a very long connection with France and French politics. You speak the language fluently. As we discovered in episode one, your family, some of your cousins are still there, etc. So I'm going to ask the first and very, very simple question, especially given the fact that the medium of communication is English. So I'm assuming that most people who know something about France, or even those who don't, have heard it from either a US media outlet or BBC or some British outlet, etc. So I have two questions. Number one, in a very simple kind of way, how do you see the situation in France? Because it seems that society is splitting into two camps, as this person in 1848 said, at the face of it at least. Um, and B, in France in particular, do you see that the US media representations of what is going on in France are biased, or at the very least, they abstract from certain things that a US audience should be interested in? So there's two parts to my questions. Number one, could you just explain in a simple kind of way what's going on in France, particularly in the light of these recent electoral, conflicts, etc.?
Okay. I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it as an American, which I am, and from the standpoint of the United States, even though I understand many of you who are hopefully watching this program are neither European nor American, but are in many other parts of the world. But you know a lot about the United States, given the role that it has played in the world for the last 75 years at least. So here's how I would begin. The United States is now in the early stages of the decline of its empire. It has lost the last few wars, typical of a declining empire. It lost the war in Vietnam. It lost the war in Afghanistan. It lost the war in Iraq. It is losing the war in Ukraine, and I could go on, but I don't need to. Those are very important losses. The US dollar is much less the international currency today than it was 20 years ago, and then already it was less than it was 40 years ago. It's now less than half of the reserves held in central banks around the world. It used to be 70, 80%. So this is, I could give you many more signs. The aggregate GDP of the G7, the United States and its major allies, is now less than the aggregate GDP of China and the BRICS. Not the new BRICS, 11 countries, but the first five: Britain, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, before the next six joined. And the gap between the aggregate GDP of the G7 and the aggregate GDP of the BRICS is getting wider with every year. They crossed in the year 2020, and the advance of the BRICS over the GDP of the G7, it just gets bigger and bigger. This year, the IMF thinks the United States economy will grow about 2.5%. And this year, the IMF believes the economy of the People's Republic of China will grow 5%. That ratio is lower than it has been most of the last 25 years, when it has been more between 2 and 3 times the rate of growth. Nobody believed 30 years ago that such a thing was possible, that kind of rate of growth differential would be sustainable. And it has, in fact, lifted China to a position of real competitor to the United States, which hasn't had a real economic competitor for a century. It's very important. This is the first time, which is why it's new, which is why it is frightening the United States, which is half the reason for the war in Iraq, for the US endorsement of Israel, for the Seventh Fleet in the South China Sea, and a whole lot of other aspects of this situation. France, by contrast, is in the long distance. It lost its empire long ago. It had a big one. It had a big one in Africa, had a big one in Asia, had a little bit in Latin America. Very little is left, and what's left isn't much of a colonial territory the way it once was. And the French have had to get used to the fact that they're not a major power. They just aren't. Very difficult. I understand that people in the colonial territories, having felt victimized by colonialism, which they certainly were, don't want to have too much of a heartbeat for the difficulties and pains of the colonizers. But remember, in the colonizers, the mass of people were not the great beneficiaries of colonialism. Most of what was gleaned from colonialism was kept by the people at the top. Indeed, and maybe this is the most important point, as the empire gets taken away, lost through wars, or lost through revolutions that simply achieve independence, political, if not economic at first, or whatever the reasons are, the people at the top in a colonial system are the ones able to use their power and their position as capitalists to hold on to all the wealth colonialism gave them. They push the burden of a declining colonialism onto the mass of people. And of course, what that does is give them the opportunity at home in Britain or France for the people at the top to distract their own population from what they're doing, offloading the costs of a vanishing empire onto the middle and the bottom. They need to blame somebody else. They need the middle and the bottom to get angry, not at them for offloading the costs of the empire. So, how is that done? Well, one of the ways is to blame the immigrants. Very popular, very important. Not because of what it does to the economy, which is marginal, because you're scapegoating the poorest of the poor. That's what you're doing. And you're doing it in a way that minimally disturbs your system and maximally disturbs the immigrant community, which you can see. But it creates animosity, hatred, bitterness between the native and the immigrant, even if the immigrant's been there for generations already. It's wonderfully useful, terribly exciting as a way to manage the decline of empire. The United States is at the early stages working all this out, how it's going to do it. And the Republicans will do it somewhat different from the Democrats. But to work it out, or facilitating the offloading of the costs, you bet. The California, which is one of our most liberal states, is now allowing cities and towns to destroy the communities of the homeless, the tent communities that are in every major California city. New York City today began with the authority of the governor, a liberal Democrat who spoke at the Democratic National Convention, Ms. Hochul, and the mayor, an African American named Adams of the city of New York, where I'm living and speaking to you now. He is the mayor, with the governor's approval, is now evicting migrant homeless families from the shelters they had been given, because the law in New York City is that you have to offer shelter to homeless people. They're no longer going to do that for the immigrant. Now, the cruelty, the immorality of all it, grotesque. Will it fly? Looks like it. These are steps, but because the French experience is longer, and because in France there is a revolutionary tradition, And I urge those of you that are not familiar with the French revolutionary tradition to take a moment when you have some time, read up on it. By revolutionary tradition, I mean at least go back to the French Revolution of 1789 and to the revolutionary activities that took place in France. France is unique, and the whole question of how and why is something that ought to get a lot more attention than it has. But we know it's unique for the following reason. The end of feudalism in France with the French Revolution in 1789 was a cut with feudalism that was much sharper, much more profound than happened in most of the rest of Europe. Why? The cut in the revolution from feudalism to capitalism, accomplished by the French Revolution, not only dispossessed the feudal landlord class, not altogether, but it was the blow that made the difference. It took a little while to finish it off. But it also cut the French from the Roman Catholic Church, which was the ideological partner of feudalism in France. The church in France never recovered. Education was secularized. When the Pope visits France, they cannot fill the stadiums. It's just not, it's not Poland, it's not Ireland, it's not even Italy, it's France. And everybody knows. In French movies, the person who's mocked the most often is the village priest. The best he can get is comedy. Even that is often not provided to him. In 1848, the revolution in France was the most overwhelming in terms of the threat to the new bourgeois system. As if that one weren't enough, 20 years later, 23 to be exact, you had the first working class takeover of a government, overthrow the capitalist government and establish the workers as their own political authority. It's called the Paris Commune, 1871. That commune, Marx was still alive, led him to write the famous pamphlets applying his work because, to his amazement, it was ready. The enthusiasm for the 1848 uprising, which is what sparked the writing of the Communist Manifesto, was mild compared to what he saw as possible in Paris in 1871. Lenin studied Marx's critique of what the Paris Commune failed to do as a guide to what he did in 1917 in Russia. The influence of France on modern everything anti-capitalist is stunning. And today, it's again unique in a way that really deserves attention.
Wow.
I realize as I'm explaining this that there's another way to tell you why it might be worthwhile to read Hegel, even if you're more of an activist and less of a theoretician, even though hopefully most of you are both. They need each other in the same person. There's a line in Lenin when he was in exile and couldn't be politically active in the usual way. He decided to use his time to read Hegel, and he kept notebooks. If you look up the collected works of Lenin, you'll find the Conspectus on Hegel. That's what it was called, a conspectus on Hegel. And in it is the following line: you cannot understand Marx without reading and understanding Hegel. Lenin wrote that. When Many years later, the French Marxist Louis Althusser, with whom I had the good fortune to work for a while and to study in Paris, when he decided to bring Hegel into modern French Marxism, he began with that quote from Lenin, which is where I learned about it.
Wow.
Okay, back to France now. What the French do is they believe in revolutionary action. Not like in the United States on the 4th of July, where you wear a flag pin and you put on a continental soldier's hat. But in really in their lives, in their guts, they understand the meaning of, in French, le peuple, the people. That's why they had the yellow vest movement a few years ago. They go into the streets at the drop of a hat. If you're a member of one of the left parties in France, you get a phone call from the party organizer when they need people at the demonstration. And if you can't go this time when you're called, a note is made because the next time they call, you have to go. That's part of what it means to be a member of a party. It's just a different conception of revolution. Okay, why do I tell you this? Because right now in France, you have a remarkable situation. The sitting president, Emmanuel Macron, is finished. He's done. He's history. You're watching what in the United States is called a lame duck. In the last national election that really counted, he came in third out of three major options, a distant third, only because of the two-step system of the French elections. In the second step, he was able to survive because he made deals with the right-wing fascistic extreme, which is important in French politics now also, as it, by the way, has always been for at least the last century. Okay. The largest block of votes now in the National Assembly in France, the key law-making body in the French Republic, is something called the New Popular Front. It's a composition of four left-wing parties that have existed in France for some time, but have been at each other's throats with doctrinal and other disputes, which they overcame because it was obvious to almost everybody that unity on the left would get them a massive vote, whereas being four different parties would destroy their ability to have real power. So they got together just a few, months. We count them in months ago, year or two ago, not very long. Here are the four parties. The largest one is called France Unbowed, La France Insoumise. It's led by the name you need to follow now in France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a lifelong leftist, former communist, socialist, and so on. His is the largest party. The three other parties are the French Green Party, the French Socialist Party, and the French Communist Party. The four together are the single largest bloc in the parliament. Only maneuvers by the president have prevented them from naming the new prime minister, which they are entitled to do. And they may still be able to do it. We'll see. By parliamentary rules that they're playing with. Okay?
Yes.
So,
So,
all right.
so I just wanted to, for those of you who are interested in, because Rick pointed out this particular problem, I want to be sure that we draw that particular connection. Um, this lovely book on the French Revolution. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't know the French like Rick, as well as this recent book, A People's History of the French Revolution. I want to ask you this question, Rick, because I was looking at something that you talked about, uh, Marx's articles on the class struggles in France. And this connects with what we discussed in the last episode as well, um, whereby it seems that when Marx is analyzing this concrete situation between 1848 to 1850, which is what we're trying to do right now, we're analyzing a concrete situation in France right now. He says something really fascinating, and this is Engels who's criticizing his friend's work 4 decades later in 1893. And he's saying that some things Marx missed because it's difficult to look at all the data and economic events and blah, blah, blah. But what is interesting here is that he says that it was not the French bourgeoisie that ruled under Louis Philippe, but one faction of it: bankers, stock exchange kings, railway kings, blah, 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 all the rest of it. So it seems, so in this analysis, there's not one class like bourgeoisie and proletariat. There's the financial bourgeoisie, there's the industrial bourgeoisie, there's the petty bourgeoisie, there's all kinds of factions of classes. And as you pointed out with the NPF, it seems that a theme in the French Revolution, and correct me if I'm wrong here, has always been that factions of ruling class interests coalesce together. I mean, Marx talks about these legitimists, as they were called, who were trying to restore the monarchy and all the rest of it.
Right.
And I found a lot of parallels between them and Marie Le Pen's party and some of the things that they stand for. As I did with the people's response in this book, like the people's history of the French Revolution, it seems that a coalition of radical forces, some representing, you know, middle class people, some representing working class people, some representing, as you said, the interests of people who stood up for the Paris Commune. Um, do you see that uh, there's some kind of parallels here, given that Engels said over here that that crisis in 1848 had something to do with the world systemic crisis? And you seemed to be of the view that there's a world systemic change taking place right now as well, with the rise of China, COVID, and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. Do you think that, and particularly I really liked your point about France's decline relative to the US as an empire, because I read something a few months ago where there were coups in many former African, former French colonies in Africa, and they nationalized their uranium resources, etc., etc. I'm so there does seem to be some connection here, um, between some parallel, historical parallel here, between what Marx was describing between 1848 to 50, this world systemic crisis and all the rest of it, and society being pulled into, various camps, coalitions developing in the right and the left. So do you see that this situation is somewhat comparable in the historical sense, and B, the kinds of responses that we're seeing in France, at least, not in the US per se. We're going to return to the US later. But do you think that this is kind of in line with the Marxist idea that, well, history moves in all kinds of weird trajectories? And just, for example, just this NPF that you described. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, these people were fighting with one another, and now they're in this coalition. How do you see this entire historical situation?
Well, I think there's a line somewhere in Marx, and it probably in the manifesto, that got given this sort of prominence that it didn't deserve. He was trying to summarize a lot of material that he had already analyzed. Anyway, the line reads, more and more the bourgeois, the capitalist world is dividing into two great classes: the employers on the one hand and the proletariat on the other. People took this comment as a license to say about Marxism something which I believe is a caricature. That in Marxism, there's two classes: the capitalist, the bosses, and the workers. The kind of shorthand that an organizer uses. There's the bosses and the workers, as if Marxist theory couldn't or didn't recognize complexity beyond two. And that's just silly. If you understand the basis of Marxism in terms of the production and distribution of surplus, already you know at least three. You know that there's the worker who produces the surplus, there's the capitalist who takes it into his hands, who appropriates it as profit, and so on. And then there are all the people to whom the capitalist distributes portion of the surplus, to the banker as interest on the loan, to the shareholders as dividends on the shares that they own, to the managers as fees and budgets to do their managing. So there are three classes: the producers of surplus, the appropriators of surplus, and the recipients of distributed shares of this surplus. That's worked out in Marx's Capital explicitly, not a two-class system, but a basically three-class system. And then, of course, Marx understood that these classes are all not homogeneous. All the recipients are the same or not at all. That would be the kind of narrow-minded, caricaturish thing that the simpleton would do. It's insulting to Marx by people who have half to show for it in their lifetimes as the people making these criticisms do. Marx smart enough to understand that there are different factions. There are different factions in a factory among the workers. There are different factions among the capitalists. There are different factions among those who live off distributions. And when Marx does the work of applying his theory, he talks about all those factions, as in the class struggles in France. Here's another example. One of the great books on the economic history of Russia up to the revolution is called The History of Russia. It was written by Lenin. In there are all kinds of factions and fractions of the peasant class, big peasants, little peasants. He has all kinds of ways of capturing what were important differences among them that mattered to them, that gave subgroups of them a certain cohesion that makes them important players in the history that he wants to recount. The notion that the great thinkers of Marxism lived in the world of a caricature, scarecrow, a stick figure, workers and capitalists, that's whether it's intended as or not as a caricature, that's what it is. And a serious theorist who talks like that either doesn't know what he or she is doing or intends to render as simple minded what is a much more complex and carefully worked out theory.
Wow. So, one of the things that you talked about, and this is a theme that you've been developing a lot in your videos and in your lectures, etc., is that you connect the entire story back to world capitalism, because you look at the entire planet as basically in the present era a surplus value extracting machine,
Oh,
right? And this is the birth of modern capitalism, genocide, and colonialism, etc. And whenever there is a crisis in capitalism, um, the it's transferred onto the poorest of the poor, the wretched of the earth, as Fanon called them, right? I mean, blame it on the immigrant. Even in Britain, for example, people of my community, South Asian, people, are being tortured, brutally hunted down, etc. All kinds of crazy stuff is taking place. Now, you're an economist, and I mean, you did your PhD studying colonialism as well. Um, what's the story here? I mean, what happens? Because is it just economics, or is it, as Wilhelm Reich also pointed out, some interaction that takes place with a crisis in capitalism of any kind, inflation, unemployment, blah blah blah, and how it reacts with uh, human perception or psychology, right? What is it? I mean, it's unfortunate that many people support, for example, Le Pen in France, right? A lot of people, even working class people, support bourgeois far right parties in Britain and in the US.
yeah.
What the hell is going on here? I mean, what do you see as a Hegelian and as a Marxist?
Okay, again, this is an enormous issue. Let me unpack it as follows. Marx somewhere explains a very pregnant idea that he never develops, or at least doesn't develop very far, that one of the historic functions of capitalism is to create a world market, to finally bring all the disparate parts of this planet into a kind of network of interactions, so you can think of it the way we now think of a community, a village, or even a nation. And that capitalism was doing it, and that the vehicle for doing that were world trade and colonialism. And the horror of it was that it would be done in the interest of capitalism, not in the interest of a global community. And the way it would happen was the way in which capitalism had always grown would be the way it would take over the whole planet. Remember, capitalism starts in towns. It starts by merchants who begin to not just want to buy and sell, but actually produce what they sell because they can make more profit than simply buying and reselling. Okay? So they need workers. Where are the workers going to come from? Well, in feudalism, the workers are all in the countryside. So you begin to have the fantastic migration that has been the major story of the last several centuries. The vast movement of rural agricultural people into the urban capitalist industrial centers, whether you're in Asia, Africa, Latin America, everywhere. That's the story. First, they come from nearby, then they come from further away. If they're not your own country, then you bring them in from another country. If they begin to be competitive, well, then you carve out your colonial area, and the immigrants come from there, from Jamaica to England, or from South Asia to England, and from South Africa to Holland, or wherever the various systems set it up. And you eventually produce a world economy. The problem is, what happens then? And where are we now in that process? Because if Marx is right, there's going to be a very serious problem when they run out of people. When there's no more people, it becomes an even more urgent problem if the existing working class stops reproducing itself, let alone growing. Then you can't expand geographically to find more workers, and you can't develop internally, intensively, by growing your population. Well, here we are. We are already at a point where the majority of the world's population is no longer reproducing itself. I don't know if you watch these statistics. I do, because of this. And we are not, the United States long ago stopped growing. The only growth we have here is migration, which means loss of population somewhere else. We don't reproduce. Europe doesn't reproduce. Japan doesn't reproduce. China and India are at the turning point. They won't be reproduced. Even if they are right now, it's over. And the decline is crystal clear everywhere else as well, too, with very, very few exceptions. And where are they going to go on Earth? Greenland? Antarctica? Not yet. And not for a very long time. We're running out of people, and we're running out of space. We're not there yet, but we're getting close. That's the first point. Here's the second point. The center of capitalist growth has moved. It once was in England, that's where it begins, in the 17th, 18th century. Then it moves to Western Europe, then to the rest of Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, and from there, via colonialism, everywhere else. While it moves, its dynamic center also moves. For example, here in the United States, the dynamic center of capitalism originally in the 18th century was New England. In the 19th century, it basically moved to the Midwest, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Then, at the end of the 20th century, it moved again to the American South and the Southwest. And now, in the last 25 years, the last 40 years, it moved out of the United States to Canada, to Mexico, and increasingly now to China, to India, to Brazil. The center of capitalist dynamism has left the United States. Profit maximization investment strategy is what drove it. The Chinese offered to the American capitalist class the two key requisites to profitability: cheaper labor than they could get in the United States, of roughly equal quality, and the biggest, fastest growing market. Business school students in the United States learn if you want your business to succeed, go to where the wages are lowest and the rate of growth is the highest. And that place is called China, and it has been for a long time. And if you want now, India and Indonesia and Vietnam and some others. But the story is the same. That's where the dynamic, explosive growth is. China has it all: the manufacturing, now the services, and the high tech. So they are the great competitor. But this the center of capitalism. And after that, where's it gonna go? Africa, okay? That gives it a little more time, but not a lot. And it's not clear that Africa, with its limits, can handle being the focal place to which all the rest of the world and the trauma of the United States right now, shaping its politics, the very phenomena of a Donald Trump or of a Marine Le Pen. It's the decline of Western capitalism. The center of capitalism has moved on, and it's left behind empty factories, empty cities, no money, as the rich hold on to what they got. The vast man. That's why immigrant families can't stay in a shelter in New York City. That's why the federal minimum wage in this country, last raised in 2009 to the royal sum of $7.25 an hour, has not been raised in the last 15 years. Every year prices went up. In some years, as much as 7, 8, 9% in 1 year. Over 15 years, the price goes up. The minimum wage stays at $7.25. This is the savaging of the poorest of the poor, the people who live on $7.25 an hour. Our major cities, New York, San Francisco, are unlivable except for rich people. Nobody can afford to pay the rent. We are becoming, in the United States, the kind of country we used to watch on television. Rich enclaves where all the bright and clever young people want to live, and then a vast ocean of poverty in all directions around them. The part of the country you zip through on the superhighway or the rapid train or fly over with the airplane. And the country shows it falling apart. Political arrangements can't be sustained. Capitalism is in its what? Its decline. It's not just the US empire. The Europeans are declining. They can't sustain their system either. Their ruling groups are in more trouble than the United States, which is why they have become the vassals of the United States. The only way they think they can hold on in Scandinavia, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, is by being close to the Americans who are showing them the way to do that. They're becoming more and more alienated from their own people. That's why fascistic right wingers can say, hey, we're not being taken care of, can point to the immigrants and say, they get a welcome here, but we who've lived here for 50 generations, we are neglected. There's truth there. It's not that the immigrants are given a good time, they aren't. But the bitterness, the jealousy, where does that come from? And that's real. Those people's suffering is real. You don't like it, and I don't either, that they take it out on the immigrants, but they have to take it out somewhere. And the right wing arrives, as it always does, to do the bidding of the top by focusing the anger on ethnic subgroups, on immigrants, and with a little effort on homosexuals or Jews or all the other typical candidates when things go south. But the important issue is things are going badly in capitalism. Not in China, India, there it's growing. They have the problems of growth, which are serious and can be deadly. We don't have those problems. We have the problems of a decline for which there is no solution. What are you going to do? This decline is going to go on whatever happens in Ukraine. It's going to go on whatever happens in Israel and Palestine, short of a nuclear war. Then the game is over.
Yeah.
And the very thinking which exists in our country here in the United States of using nuclear weapons, that too is a symptom that without those people knowing it, they kind of understand, and some of them say it, quote, time is not on our side. That's their way of recognizing that the Western capitalist system has now peaked. It had the center of it, the dynamic core, has moved to Asia, and everybody wonders how far and how fast the down is going to go here. And while Kamala Harris smiles, and while the Democrats have a new lease on life with a much more positive image, that's just another way to try to cope with the depression. And I mean that not just in economics, I mean it more in psychological terms, that is settling on the American people. There's a reason why the American people, with 4% of the world's population, 4.5%, consume something like 40 to 50% of the psychotropic drugs that are taken by the human race. There's a reason. And the reason has to do with these issues, which the whole Marxist canon makes it available for you to begin to see, although a lot of work has to be done to flesh out and to debate some of the things I'm telling you in a summary form.
Wow. Wow. It really changes the way you think about the politics and political situation in different countries once you accept that we're living in a world capitalist system. And so I was reminded of one of your teachers, Stephen Heimer, who was really big on, he was one of the major theorists on how international business structures are organized and how that is going to have an impact. And I had the chance of looking at some of his work right before he passed away, unfortunately, where he's making predictions about the year 2000. And it turns out that, the guy was spot on about certain things. But I wanted to pick your brain about, because we're running out of time as well. Um, when you say that the center of gravity has moved towards the global south, as it is called now in fashionable circles,
Uh,
um, would you agree with the idea that, given the fact that since world capitalism is now organized, as Stephen Heimer said, via the corporation, and shareholder wealth maximization has become the objective of the corporation, or has been for the last 6 to 7 decades. Would you agree that since the elites, the financial elites, the people who have the M in the circuit of capital, right, people who have the money, since they own the stocks of companies like Apple, for example, or Microsoft, um, which in turn produce their products in, they manufacture and assemble their products in China or India, depending on whoever has the lower unit labor costs and infrastructure and policies and blah, blah, blah. Would you agree that it's okay for the financial bourgeoisie, the elites in Western economies, in the US, even, for example, they don't care about where the stuff is produced, because at the end of the day, they just care about their stock going from 180 to 250, right? And similarly, the people in the global south, it's not that everyone is kind of benefiting, because people point to Ambani and Adani and blah, blah, blah. It's the elites who are benefiting, because look at Bangladesh and the crisis over there. Look at Kenya. People are revolting even in the so-called countries benefiting from investments, foreign direct investments in these countries. People are unhappy over there. So would you agree that the way we've designed this global system of vassalage, if you like, so that we can suck from the last cent from the poorest of the poor, right? Would you agree that the people who are really benefiting from this charade, from this entire story, are the elites, the financial bourgeoisie of elite, of traditionally, what were called imperialist economies, um, as well as the elites in um the global south? So, if that is indeed the case, that the poorest of the poor are suffering in the advanced economies as well as in the peripheral economies, is there a possibility? Because when Marx talks about this project, he talks about the workers of the world. Hmm? Is transnational solidarity and alliance possible given the fact that the system is not working for the wretched of the earth? That's my question to you.
Yeah. My short answer is absolutely yes. Not only would I say yes, I think the chances are greater. I think that workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose for your chain but your chains, is a slogan that has more chance of being successful now than when it was first articulated, because capitalism has finally produced a global working class. Let me comment a little bit. The financial leaders, Jamie Dimon, for example, the head of JP Morgan Chase, the largest American bank, he's smart enough to know that the people who have the dominant role in the centers of financial capitalism, which is still New York City, they need the subgroups, the elites, as you call them, in Bangladesh or in Malaysia or in Nigeria or anywhere else. They don't have the time, they don't have the skill, they don't have the knowledge. They are willing to partner with those people. They need them. They need the Nigerian financial group to organize a Nigerian industrial class and to use them and to help them manage their government and their military to make sure that the working class is playing the role it needs to play in producing oil in Nigeria or to producing clothing in the factories of Bangladesh or whatever. This is an articulated system. And that means that there are all kinds of opportunities for conflict, just as there were conflicts between some lords in a feudal system and others. Half of the plays written by William Shakespeare are about the conflicts, the murderous conflicts among the feudal lords in England and how that shook up the country. All of that can happen among financial elites in the big centers, between them and the elites below them, between the lower elites and their own military or their own, and on and on and on. That's a constantly evolving situation, and uprisings by workers can change the balance inside any little country or globally. The effects of the gilets jaunes, as they were called in France, the yellow vests, that ramified through the oil market, that ramified throughout Western European politics. It frightened the ruling class there because it was incredible, the yellow vest movement. It included the Le Pen, the right wing. It included the communists, the trade unions. Yet it was independent of all of those. It brought them all together in an opposition. The government raised taxes on fuel. The mass of people went into the streets. The government withdrew the rule. The government said you can't retire until you're 64. The people said no, 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 no. Okay, back to 62. On and on and on, and that frightened the ruling class. So they decided to be more conservative, to move more towards the British and the Americans, which put them right in the position to be used, and that's what they were, used to fund the Ukraine war, a war which they didn't need, didn't want, and frightened them because they worry about where the Russians might go next, and with good reason. And their problem was they didn't know how to react, so they supported the United States, which now puts them at odds with their own people, which is why you had in part the vote in England bringing in the Labour Party, and in part the vote that brought in the New Popular Front in France. And that is now scaring everybody. They don't know quite what to do. But by the way, playing off Bangladesh against Vietnam, against Indonesia, against Malaysia, this is an old game for capitalism. American capitalists have been playing off California against Ohio, Texas against New York. They know exactly how to go into a state legislator, how to buy political influence, how to become a funder of the right political organization to move things the way you want. They know how to do this. They can do this on a global scale. It's simply an extension of what they've learned to do over the last century here in the United States. The real wild card here is China and the BRICS. That they don't control, that they have badly mismanaged. They are now in a conflictual situation. The image here I'd like to leave you with is the image that when the little colony of what we now call the United States broke away or tried to break away from the British Empire in 1770s, a war took place, the so-called War of Independence. The British assumed that by military force they could squash the independence movement. To their immense surprise, they were defeated. The United States became independent. In 1812, a few years later, they tried again with another war, which they also lost. After that, the British decided, okay, we have to come to terms. Let's divide the world. You can have Latin America. The so-called Monroe Doctrine, by which the United States declares that Latin America is not going to be colonized by anybody except the United States. That's 1830. That's a few years after they win that war of 1812. And the British say, okay, that's the deal. You get Latin America. We can keep the rest of our empire, and you don't become an agitator for independence anywhere else. That's the deal. And that deal was kept. And here's the reason I tell you this story. One of the things that may surprise people is the arrival, and I don't think it'll be much longer before we see it, of a political movement in the United States that attacks Republicans and Democrats on the grounds of threatening us all with nuclear war by their hostility to Russia and China, and that what they ought to do is come to a deal patterned on what Britain and the United States did, but obviously different because there's no more part of the world to divide up between them.
Wow, wow, wow. So another world is possible,
Oh boy,
but within.
radically
Yes.
different political paths are available. The fact that they're not debated is because those who still cling to what the existing status quo don't want political initiatives, movements, even intellectual ones, because of where that can go. They're sitting on a very insecure throne, which is a message to all radicals paying attention to this program. This is a time to move. Possibilities are opening up here that we need organized intervention from a Marxist perspective. We can do it. The audience for it is there. The militants for it are there. The vulnerability of the system is there. We have to overcome our hesitancy because of the past, understandable, but not allowable in terms of strategic advance.
Wow, wow. I'm not going to say anything else beyond that, guys. We've run out of time. I hope you got something out of it. As Rick has pointed out, it's time to dream and dream big. To the friends, good night. And to the enemies, if you don't let us dream, we will not let you sleep. Take care.
Bye bye.